So we started a new series last week, and it's about tests. And I'm wanting to get right into it tonight because I want to give us some time to fellowship a little bit later, but I've got a lot that I want to cover. It's going to be a very powerful series if you will dive in with us. There's a lot of times when we come up with some great series, and I'm telling you what, Pastor and Chapman and I, we get so much out of it. I mean, it's just crazy how much we get out of it. And sometimes we feel like everybody comes along with us and gets something out of it. Sometimes we don't. But we invite you to join with us as we learn how to navigate the tests that we will face in life. And we will learn later on that it doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how close you are to the Lord. Every one of us is going to face tests in life. And so that's what this series is about. Our key passage, the foundation for what we're teaching on from the scripture, is found in the book of James. It's chapter 1, and it starts in verse 2. I want to revisit this just to I really want to make sure that we're solid on the foundation here. So in James chapter 1, starting in verse 2, it says, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. If you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and He will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. But when you ask Him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. Such people should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they are unstable in everything they do." Skipping down to verse 12, it says, "God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love Him. And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, 'God is tempting me.' God is never tempted to do wrong, and He never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in the heavens. He never changes or casts a shifting shadow. He chose to give birth to us by giving us His true word, and we, out of all creation, became His prized possession." Now, let's just get real right from the start. When troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. Woohoo! I mean, who's excited when trouble comes your way? I really don't know of anybody that I've ever seen go, yes. I shouldn't say that. That's not really true. I have people around me who will point it out. Here's what we do. We can point it out for other people when they're going through it. So when I'm going through a rough time, some of my friends will say, and I'm grateful for it. I'm not putting this down. I'm grateful for those friends who will say, "Listen, God must be getting ready to do something really awesome right now because you're facing some great adversity." And that, I think there is some truth in that. But the fact of the matter is, it's so much easier to point that out for someone else than it is to kind of let that be the posture of your heart at all times when you're going through difficult times. But the Word says, consider it an opportunity for great joy. And we're going to learn why we should be doing that. Verse 3 is an interesting verse because it says, "For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow." When your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. Okay, that would imply that testing is a good thing. So the Word is telling us to consider it all joy when we face tests in life. it tells us that it gives our endurance a chance to grow. So that tells me that actually the tests in life are a good thing. And we tend to think about tests in life as bad things. Now, I'm not saying we don't face bad things. And we're going to talk about what the bad things are versus what the good things are here in just a minute. But it says, so let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. So the more you're tested, the more you're able to grow your faith and your endurance and get to the point where you are perfect and complete, needing nothing. Testing is a good thing. Verse 13 indicates that temptation is not a good thing. So if you look, it says, remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own evil desires, which entice us and drag us away. Temptation's not a good thing, and God's never behind temptation. And we sometimes attribute temptation in life. We get mixed up, and we call the temptation the test, and that's not what it is. The biblical definition of a temptation is an enticement to sin. And temptations can come from the devil himself, or they can come from our own sinful, selfish desires. Actually, they always come from our own sinful, selfish desires, because what does the devil tempt us with? The things that appeal to our flesh and to our own sinful, selfish desires. And so temptation is simply an enticement to sin. It is an open invitation to do something that God says is morally wrong. And people give in to temptations every day. Every single person in this room has done that. When we make an idol out of something or someone other than God, we've given in to temptation. And that can be our phones, that can be our television, that can be Netflix, that can be anything that we make an idol out of. That can be whatever hobby you happen to have. It can be a person. When we elevate as parents, when we elevate our children to a higher level of importance than God, then we have given in to temptation. And so when we directly violate any of the commands of God that are found in his word, we've given in to temptation. When we don't love God and love people, we've given in to temptation to put ourselves above other people. But Pastor taught this last week. The temptation is not the test. And we get those two words mixed up. They are not the same thing. So I think it's important that we understand the temptation is an enticement to sin. And here in just a little bit, we're going to get a definition of what the test is. The temptation is not the test. The test, though, is, and I'm going to give you a broader definition here a little bit later, but ultimately the test is this. Will you have a God response to the temptation that's in front of you? That's the test. Will you have a God response to the temptation that is in front of you? It doesn't really matter whether the temptation comes from within, without, none of that really matters. What matters is whether or not you have a God response. When I give a kid a test at school, I want them to pass. I never hand a kid a test going, man, I just can't wait to see them fail this thing. I never do. None of the supervisors in our school ever give a kid a test going, boy, I hope they fail this one. We never rejoice when they do. We want them to be successful. I'm not secretly trying to put something in the test to cause them to fail. I want them to pass. The test is intended for them to pass. It's necessary, though, to have a test, because without taking the test, we may or may not know what our areas of vulnerability are. See, I want the test to reveal to the student what responses they have that are right and what responses they have that are wrong. And without a test, we just don't know what we don't know. So tests are actually important and good. We often have students who go into a test and they think they're going to pass a test and they don't. We don't rejoice over that. We say, okay, well, now you know what you don't know. I don't get mad at them for failing a test. It's unproductive to be mad when you fail a test. But I do encourage students to study the things that they had the wrong responses to. And a lot of times I allow them to come back in and just take the portion of the test that they failed. Why? They don't need to take the part of the test that they passed. They know that. So they continue to be tested in the areas where we don't know if they know. We're trying to reveal what they know and what they don't know. But they will continue to be tested on the things they've not had success in until they pass. Think that through. Think about tests in life. It's important that we embrace the opportunity, that we consider it to be joy to be able to go through these tests and difficult times. Why? Because we can develop endurance, we can pass them and move on. We don't have to keep taking the same test over and over and over again. When Satan sees that you've won, you've gotten victory in your life over something, he's moving on to the next thing. He's trying to find the next thing that's going to hang you up. Now, that may sound like bad news, but the more endurance you develop, the more you recognize that on the front end, and you're not led away by your own sinful desires. So there is something to be said for embracing the joy of being tested. So temptations are enticements to sin. Tests are opportunities for the truth to be revealed in our lives. Temptations are traps intended to catch you and harm you. Tests are arranged circumstances intended to prove you. Temptations are chances for you to indulge your flesh. And tests are opportunities for you to show your character. Do you see the difference between a temptation and a test? Tests reveal what areas of our lives we've overcome sin in and what areas we still need to be working on. And that's a good thing. That's called sanctification, by the way. We're justified before God when we are saved, but we are continually in this cycle of sanctification, growing and maturing in our relationship with the Lord and in our responses to the temptations that come. But again, I'm going to keep saying it. The temptation is not the test. The temptation comes from Satan and the evil desires within us. The tests come from God, and they help us to know what areas we are weak in so that we can evaluate our own spiritual health and work on those areas that need work. So last week, Pastor talked about the wilderness test, and he used Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2. And it says, "Remember how the Lord your God led you through the wilderness for these 40 years, humbling you and testing you to prove your character, and to find out whether or not you would obey his commands." That's often what the test is about, is just God just testing you to see, are you going to obey me? All right? Again, the temptation comes from what? The flesh, from our own evil desires. But the test is whether or not we are going to have a God response, and that comes from the Lord. Tests reveal what's really in us. Matthew 4, verse 1, it says, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil." Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted for the purpose of being tempted by whom? The devil. It wasn't God who was tempting Jesus, but it was certainly God that was allowing him to go through this test. Tests reveal what is really in us. And I love it because we find through the Word that what was in Jesus was just the Word. I mean, we know He is the Word. Yeah. But every opportunity He had to be tempted, He reached into Himself and withdrew the Word. And the Word is how He defeated the enemy. The Word is how He overcame. And the Word is how He passed the test. And so we are oftentimes frustrated by a test, and God is saying, listen, this is an opportunity for you. You can't know where you are weak if you never go through a test. Let's develop some endurance. Luke chapter 6, verse 45 says, a good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart, and an evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. What you say flows from what is in your heart. And so tonight we're going to talk about another test. Last week it was the wilderness test. Today, and let's just say this, in the Old Testament, God led you through the wilderness for 40 years. That was a test, all right? Humbling you and testing you to prove your character. In Matthew 4, the New Testament, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. So we talked about the wilderness test last week, but tonight we're going to talk about a different test, and this one is the time test. This is a test I think that I have personally struggled with a lot in my own life. Why? Because I am a very impatient person. I want what I want when I want it. I don't want to wait for anything. I want it, and I want it now. And if the truth is told, I mean, if God would just let me stay that way, I'd still be that way now. But it's a struggle for those of us who have the personality type that is just prone to being impatient. But here's what you got to know. God created time. It was his plan that the earth would operate on a schedule. Day and night, and seed time and harvest. And when you plant a seed, there isn't an immediate response of the seed to just grow up out of the dirt. You plant the seed, and then you do what? You wait. You wait. And you let God do things under the earth that you are incapable of doing yourself. You let the seed do what it was destined to do when God created the world. And you don't get to decide how long the wait is. And you shouldn't. You didn't create the seed. You don't know what's being done under the ground. You don't know what's happening inside the seed. You don't get to tell the seed when to break through the ground or how much it should grow in a day. Those are all things that are related to time. And those things operate on God's time, not ours. There are things that can only be decided by God. He determines the germination period, the seedling period, the growth rate, the maturity rate, and the timing of the fruit production. There are certain fruits we know that are only harvested one time a year. How much better would it be for a farmer if an apple tree just produced apples all year long? And if we could just have fresh peaches all year long. Strawberries all year long. But we don't get to make those decisions. Guess, we're not the creator. The creator gets to decide those things. And guess what? He created you. So there are issues with time that he gets to decide for us, no matter how impatient we may be. Abraham and Sarah. Now, if you were not here on Sunday and didn't get to hear Susan talk about Abram and Sarai and their transition into being Abraham and Sarah, please listen to that sermon. It was something I'd never heard presented the way that she presented it. It was so good. But I want you to think about this. They didn't get to choose the time frame for God to give them the son he promised. Abraham was 75 years old when God told him that he would make him into a great nation. Abram and Sarai had been childless for decades. In Genesis 12, verse 7, it says, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. Why did Abram build an altar? Because he believed what God said. He was marking in time and marking the place geographically where God made a promise to him. And he wanted to be able to go back to that altar and be reminded of the promise. That's in chapter 12. In chapter 15, a whole three chapters later, although in time there was more time than that. But it says sometime later. And you know what? God says that to us sometimes, doesn't he? Sometime later I'm going to do that. Hey, I'm making this promise to you, and sometime later it'll happen. We don't get to choose what the sometime later is. But it says, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you and your reward will be great. Abram begins to question God. God's telling him, don't be afraid. I'm going to protect you and your reward's going to be great. But in verse 2, Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be an heir. Abram didn't really like sometime later. I don't really like sometime later. I know that you don't like sometime later. We want, when God makes a promise, we have an expectation that sometime later is going to be way sooner than what it sounds like when he says sometime later. But it says, then the Lord said to him, this is verse 4, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up in the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Sometime later. God's promises are yes and amen. Sometime later. I've got great and wonderful things for you sometime later. But that's the reality that we live in oftentimes, is that God is doing things in the unseen realm that we don't have any idea about. And sometimes he's going to lead us through some testing that's going to show us the reason we haven't gotten the promise just yet. We're not ready. I'm not ready for the promise. You know, I've said this before, and I really mean it. I wish people would take me seriously. I wish young people would take me seriously. But if God had given me for a husband the first or even the second or the third person that I just begged him for, please, God, please, I just love him so much. If God had given me what I asked for, I would not be living the blessed life that I am living right now. I would not be married to this hunk of burning love back there on the second row. I wouldn't have the children that I have. He's not read at all, just so you know. He loves when I say stuff like that. But I wouldn't have the children that I have right now. I wouldn't have the life that I have right now. I wouldn't be here with you all right now if God had just given me every little thing that I begged him for when he had great and precious promises for me. And I had to endure some tests and go through some rough times. But in that, I developed some endurance. Really, I developed standards. But, you know, if we're just being honest. But sometimes, though, that's what God's wanting you to develop. Really. But 10 years from the time God made that first promise to Abram, the promise hadn't come to pass. We get mad if it's 10 days later and it hasn't come to pass, 10 weeks later. This was 10 years and it hadn't come to pass. Abram didn't have any descendants to give the promised land to, as God told him he would be able to do. So Abram and Sarai got tired of God's timeline, and they decided to make some things happen. And 4,000 years later, roughly, we are still living with the consequences of that decision that they made. They got ahead of God. They thought they knew better than God. And they made a decision that the consequences have rippled through time and are still rippling through time to this very day. But when Abraham and Sarah got on board with God's timeline, they experienced the blessing of God. They were 90 and 100 years old. And again, I mean, we just can't even fathom. I mean, if we had a 90-year-old and a 100-year-old walk in here and say, guess what? Gender reveal. We would all just flip a lid. Let me tell you something. I had my first child at the age of 32. I had fertility issues, and we went through a lot of stuff to be able to have children. And I felt like I was 90 years old when I hit 32. Why? Because all my friends had their children when they were in their late teens and early 20s. No, seriously. But I'm just telling you that when I was going through my fertility issues, and I've told this story before, I just went through every emotion that you go through. And you go through the begging God, you're angry at God, you go through, you're bitter at all the terrible mothers that you know who already have children, and they don't even love them like I would love them if I could have them, and you just go through all the stuff, you know. But there was a point, and it was a very distinct point in that process where God just did something in my heart. He really, really changed my heart. And I began to every time those thoughts would well up in me, I had this little thing that I did, and there's this old country song, and I literally don't know any of the song except for this one line. But every time that those thoughts would well up in me, I would just stop what I was doing, and I would just say, I'm leaving it all up to you. And I would sing that to the Lord. God, I'm not going to, that's all I know of that song. Some of you who are older than me might recognize that, but I don't know it except for that. But the Lord brought that little phrase to my mind, and every single time I would start to get bitter and ugly in my heart, I would sing that. Because I was determined I wasn't going to live with that kind of ugliness in my heart. And I'm just telling you right now that was a test that I went through, and it wasn't until I began to pass the test that I began to walk into the promise that God had for my life over that. So the time test is a difficult test, but it's an important test. We need to start recognizing that temptations are going to come our way, and they never come from God. But the ability to have a God response does come from God, and that is the test. What do temptations do for us? Well, they give us, they oftentimes will tempt us to go back to old habits. Sometimes that can be because of a lack of results. You know, if you're on a diet, I've had this happen 100 times. You diet for 6 weeks. Rick and I go on one together. In 6 weeks, he's lost 800 pounds, and I've lost 0.4. So I've been very tempted, and I have failed in that endeavor many times, and I've gone back to the old way of thinking and acting. So temptations can cause us to go back to old habits. Temptations can cause us to be angry with God. We get angry with God. We blame Him for things that He's not responsible for at all. But they can cause us to do that. The enemy is sitting there constantly trying to convince you that God's responsible for all the terrible things going on in your life. And if He really loved you, He wouldn't have you go through that. That's just not true. We are tempted at times to blame God for difficult circumstances. And the fact of the matter is, we live in a fallen world, and it's fallen because of us, not because of God. And temptation will cause us to take matters into our own hands, just like Abram and Sarai did. God made a lot of promises to Abraham. He said, I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make you famous. You will be a blessing. I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. All of the people on the earth are going to be blessed because of you. And you know, God has very similar promises for each and every one of us. But before we walk into the blessing of those promises, we usually have to walk through a time of testing. In Matthew chapter 4, there are titles for each section. If you remember, I read you some it talks about Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil. Here's something I think that's kind of interesting. In the New Living Translation, there are sections, 4 sections that are titled in chapter 4. And the first one is titled The Temptation of Jesus. The second one is titled The Ministry of Jesus, or The Ministry of Jesus Begins. The third one is titled The First Disciples, and the fourth one is titled Crowds Follow Jesus. Now I want you to think about that. Section 1, the temptation of Jesus. Jesus was led by the Spirit of God into the wilderness for the purpose of being tempted. What was the test? The test was, what would his response be? He had a response that was a God response. He proved himself. And what happened? The ministry of Jesus begins. There's a lot of us that want positions and platforms. You know, you see this with a lot of people who overcome in some way, or they come and they get radically saved, and they instantly want to begin to have a platform to teach and to preach, having not been tested at all, having not been proven at all. And they think that we're being judgmental when we don't just hand them a microphone when they come into the church. And the fact of the matter is that until a person is tested and proven, they don't need a microphone. And those are things that take what? Time. They take time. Too many people want a platform, but they don't want to have to grow in their endurance and grow in their faith. Jesus had to do it. If Jesus had to do it, shouldn't we have to do it? If Abram had to endure testing to become Abraham, shouldn't we have to? And there are so many examples in the Word of people who had to endure tests. So what is the time test exactly? It's simply the ability to wait. To wait on God, to stay in faith during a season of waiting. It is a season that is sometimes prolonged when we lose faith or when we get ahead of God. You know, you've heard it talked about many times, but the Israelites in the wilderness, that was an 11-day trip that lasted them for 40 years. Why? Because they had to continue to be tested and continue to be tested and continue to be tested. It would behoove us to embrace the test and do everything we can to pass it. But there is much to be learned in a season of waiting. But you can't learn it if all you're doing is pressing forward and trying to move into the next season before God says it's time. This time test, when the promise is yours but it's not manifested in your life yet, there's a lot that can be learned in that season. In Deuteronomy 8, it says that we are humbled as we are tested, and that what is in our hearts is revealed as we are tested. And these are two very valuable aspects of testing that grow us and they mature us in the Lord. So the purpose of a time test is this. It teaches us to trust God. It teaches us to trust that God will fulfill his word. It teaches us that God will fulfill the word in his time and in his way. It teaches us that God is God and will be God no matter what our experience is. So we can stand on one leg and hold up. God's God, and God's going to do what God's going to do. That's really good, Mel. And it teaches us to expose our own personal shortcomings of impatience. You know, we dread exposure. So many people dread exposure. And you know, exposure is one of the greatest things that can happen for you if you're in sin. It's one of the greatest things. I mean, I'm not saying it's fun, but it's one of the greatest things that can happen. You know, when there was a season of time a few decades ago where there were a lot of people in evangelistic ministries that were being publicly found out to be in sin, in various types of sin. But you know, a lot of those people now have thriving ministries. Why? Because the sin was exposed, they repented, they turned from it. We don't want exposure. And if you are an impatient person, when God's telling you to be patient, that's sin. Get that out in the open, and then you can pass a time test. The time test gives us the opportunity for personal faith to grow. Our motives and our attitudes can be purified, and we can develop maturity and patience and discipline and purpose. That's what a time test is intended to do. And Abraham is a great example to us that being chosen by God doesn't exempt us from testing in life. If Abraham was tested, we will be too. So there are some signs when you are failing the time test. And Susan kind of talked on this too, but you can express doubt rather than faith. If you talk doubt all the time, you're not passing the time test. You're not allowing God to move. You're not allowing God to orchestrate things on your behalf. We know what Romans 8:28 says. All things work together for the good of those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. But if we are getting impatient, then we're not having faith, and it exposes our doubt. It also, a sign that you are failing the time test, you work to substitute your way for God's way. You're easily distracted, you murmur and complain, and you quit and release yourself of your responsibility to do what you ought to be doing for God to fulfill his part. So 5 things that you can do to pass the time test. You need to do things that require faith. There's a lot of us out here that do everything we can not to ever need faith. We need to be looking for opportunities to do things that require faith. You need to be going to church. You need to be surrounding yourself by people of God who are going to encourage you and lift you up so that your faith doesn't wane in those times of waiting. You need to worship God. You need to worship God with your whole heart, no matter where you are in the process of waiting for that promise to be given to you. You need to serve others. You won't be thinking about all the things God's not doing for you if you are working hard to serve someone else. And you need to rejoice in the promise every day. You need to bring that promise before God and thank him for what he's doing right now that you can't see, to bring that promise to pass in your life. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31 says, "Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Waiting shows us what's in our hearts. It humbles us, it produces endurance, and ultimately it produces spiritual health and maturity. Waiting isn't fun for anybody, but when you see purpose in the waiting, it makes it easier. And the way you see purpose in the waiting is to embrace the waiting. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, it says, "The Lord isn't being slow about his promise as some people think. No, he's being patient for your sake. He does not want anyone to be destroyed, but wants everyone to repent." Now, this is talking about the coming of the Lord and how he's the reason he hasn't come yet is he's trying to give as many people as he can an opportunity. But it's also a universal truth that the Lord isn't slow just for the sake of being slow. There is always purpose behind his timing, and we've got to learn to trust that. That's all.